Kia ora. The text for today from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 9, 35 to 10:1, of Jesus, motivated by compassion, sending out disciples to have authority over and cast out demons and to cure every disease, comes from the late 1st century and indicates how in the decades following his death, Jesus' followers saw their ministry and his. Firstly, in that text, note the motivation: compassion. Compassion is the place, the action, the home ground where peace and justice kiss. Compassion is why Jesus did what he did. Compassion is both the ends and means of Christian ministry. It's how we do God. There is no other way of doing God. To be clear, motivating people by threats, punishment, manipulation, violence, guilt, rewards, all those things from my 1970s New Zealand high school education, and things that many experience in church. These are not the ways of the upside down, outside in Jesus movement, Jesus kingdom, queerdom. These are not the ways of compassion. There is only compassion for Christians. And to digress a little, the lens through which Christians critique leadership, policies, practices, in crisis and normal times, is not what's good for me or my family or my church or even planetary and economic well-being. Those things at best are secondary. The lens for Christians is simply compassion. And the ways of compassion are found in the weave that brings people and holds people gently, respectfully together. Secondly, in our text, note the demonic, little horny guys. Not really. What the demonic is about is what pulls us apart, that fractures our minds, fractures our connections with community, with other humans, other ethnicities, other genders, other religions. If compassion is identifying with one another and coming together, the demonic is erecting barriers and pushing us apart. Demons and disease, sickness and spirits were all much of a muchness in the ancient world, and indeed in many times and cultures. Although the demythologizing of illness and the use of scientific method is paramount in Western world, we are increasingly becoming aware that demythologizing and Western science have their limitations. To minimize the power of myth, the power of the mind, the power of macro-synergetic forces, limits our ability to affect health and well-being for the individual and for the familial and tribal systems the individual is a part of. It affects and limits our ability to heal and to help. To digress again, part of the fallacy of liberal Protestantism, which is our cultural heritage, is to elevate reason and rationality over experience and intuition, to elevate Western modernism and method over indigenous wisdom and stories, to elevate individual prosperity and well-being over communal prosperity and well-being. So, for example, liberal Protestantism in America and liberal Catholicism, despite some outstanding individuals, has been seen by people of colour as largely part of the problem rather than part of the solution of racism. To return to our text and demons and disease, the New Testament scholar Bill Loader says, "These days we mostly shy away from such commissions to exorcise and heal. But we need to live with the modern discomfort which such passages bring, until we can find our way back into them and get in touch with what powers are alive today." So lastly then, the Matthew text asks us to identify what those powers are, what the author of Ephesians calls, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers." So what are these powers of chaos, dysfunction, separateness, of illness and death? In August, I'll be leading a study group on Jack Spong's classic 1990s text called "Rescuing the Bible from Fundamentalism." In the preamble, Jack helpfully identifies some of these principalities and powers that he is challenging. Principalities and powers that use the Bible to justify and fortify their positions. As a child of the American South, he begins with race and how the Bible was used to justify slavery, and then to justify separate schooling, and then to condone the policies of segregation and inequity. White tribalism continues to be a problem, and not just in America. As we saw outside St. John's Episcopalian Church in Washington, D.C. the other week, uncritical white tribalism still, particularly in America, wants to use the Bible as a prop to their authority rather than as a challenge to their absence of compassion. I think that phrase, principalities and powers, is helpful because many individual white Americans and many American churches are compassionate, justice-committed followers of Jesus who are appalled by the death of George Floyd and the death of other black Americans at the hands of police. But as one writer says, cycling for a black person in America is like cycling into a headwind, and for a white person, it's like cycling with a tailwind. Something unseen can push against you, whereas for a white colleague, it seems to push in your favor. And in my ministry, that analogy with the wind is what many Maori and Pacific people experience in this land. In Spong's preamble, he segues from race into physical violence, where those who use the Bible with the blinkers of literalism have used our sacred text to justify beating children, beating the devil out, to justify so-called disciplining wives, and to justify the violence of war. While these examples of American fundamentalism are both real and to most of us extreme, violence unfortunately is deeply ingrained in the Christian religious psyche. Churches generally don't have a good track record when it comes to bullying, assaults, and misuse of power. Ask most women ministers. Spong, as the Episcopalian Bishop of Newark, lived through a time when the worldwide Anglican Church wrestled with two issues: women in authority as ministers and bishops, and gay and lesbian ministers and bishops. I have been in Anglican synods, and a number of you have been in general assemblies, where we have witnessed some appalling behaviour and words said to and about women and LGBTI ministers and elders. Sometimes it is subtle, easily brushed off, easily denied. Sometimes, though, the behaviour and words are very blatant and not subject to legal constraints. So Spong names in his preamble some of the principalities and powers, the demonic, that work against compassion. Things, attitudes, myths like race, violence, gender, and sexual orientation. Things that pull us apart and separate us. And how these principalities and powers then use the Bible. I could talk about other things, attitudes and actions that pull us apart and separate us. Powers that operate in the areas of medicine, economics, technology, academia. Powers that work against community and communal well-being. But I want to focus now briefly on our other biblical text for today. The story at the Oaks of Mamre, the Annunciation of Isaac. Genesis 18, 1-12 can be read a number of ways. You can notice the unusual things, like oak trees growing in Mamre, modern-day Hebron in the West Bank. Really? Like making a few cakes for the 3 guests with 3 measures of flour. That's 23 kilograms. Really? Like the presence of Sarah, a woman and leader, not only in this story but throughout the whole Abrahamic saga. Whereas in other Mediterranean cultures before 600 BCE, very few stories of women were preserved at all. Or you could begin and stay with the simple picture of the joy of a childless, elderly woman finding she's pregnant, miraculously blessed by God. Or you could begin with a more complex picture, that here is a story about the seeds of division and violence between Arab and Jew, that reverberates down through the centuries, even to our day. Something one could blame Abraham for, or Sarah for, or some power principality that incorporated and cultivated the worst against Abraham, Sarah's, Hagar's, and Ishmael's best. Let's think about Ishmael for a moment, Isaac's older brother. He was Abraham's firstborn and heir. The reproductive wisdom of the day had the man's semen containing both egg and sperm. It was called the seed. And the woman's womb being the incubating garden for that seed. So, regardless of the mother, the first male child born of the father's sperm was the heir. It's called primogeniture. That was Ishmael. And his mother was the maid Hagar, whom Sarah had selected for that purpose. And the scandal of the story is that the patriarch Abraham rejected and sent his heir and his heir's mother, into the desert to die. And then later interpreters and editors, not wishing to sully Abraham's legacy too much, blame Sarah. Ishmael survived miraculously, and even more miraculously, did not seem to bear a grudge against his father for this violent rejection. Later in life, Ishmael dutifully joined Isaac in burying his father. Ishmael's descendants, at the time that the story was written in a text form, were seen as cousins of Israel and honorary members of the covenant. It's not quite seen that way today. So our story, the Annunciation of Isaac by these three strangers, Godish people, the future child of Abraham and Sarah, this one who would become heir and the father of Israel, is not just a mythic story about a post-menstrual woman and her elderly mate miraculously conceiving a child who would be called the child of promise and the firstborn of God's chosen people. No, this is a story that has a backdrop of injustice and violent rejection, a backdrop of separating people and races into chosen and unchosen, and a backdrop of women surviving in a patriarchal and primogeniture culture. This is not a story about Abraham at his best. This was a man, Abraham, he could exhibit extraordinary compassion. Think of the story about Sodom and Gomorrah. But he could also exhibit extraordinary violence, not just towards Ishmael, but also towards Isaac. Think of the Mount Moriah story. So in Abraham there were the powers of healing and compassion and well-being, and also the powers of violence, separation, and destruction. The gospel reading, the gospel challenge is simple. Our vocation is to plant, build, and foster the former, compassion, where peace and justice kiss, and to exorcise, expunge the powers, demons that destroy well-being, connection, and community.